Israel has made its way through the wilderness after escaping their slavery in Egypt, and they have finally arrived at Mount Sinai. Hi, I'm Father Robert Moses, and this is our study on the book of Exodus, part 6, Exodus 19 through 24. Exodus 19 begins the heart of the second great movement of the book of Exodus. The first 15 chapters form the first movement, a coherent narrative of the Lord's presence through self-revelation to Moses and Israel for the purpose of redeeming Israel from slavery in Egypt. The first movement finds its climax at the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, in which the people recall the mighty deeds of the Lord as they sing the praises of their God. The second movement is chapters 15 through 40. The wilderness narratives of Exodus 15 through 18 begin the second movement, acting as a transition from Israel's slavery as they prepare to meet the Lord at Mount Sinai. In Exodus 19, Israel finally arrives at Sinai, the site of their greatest theophany, where the Lord's presence will be revealed in glory, law, and covenant, and through which Israel will take the next step in their relationship with the Lord God. It is through their encounter at Sinai that the people of Israel first enter into a covenant relationship with the Lord. The covenant made at Sinai, like the covenant made with Abraham, is a sign that Israel has been chosen by the Lord and that the Lord will dwell with them. With the revelation at Sinai, the main theme of the book of Exodus shifts from God's power to God's holiness. The rest of the book of Exodus will indeed be concerned with how a holy God can dwell with an unholy people. William Propp rightly suggests that the book of Exodus is asking the question, how can Israel abide in relationship with the transcendent deity whose full essence the earth cannot bear? Indeed, it is this very question that the beginning of the book of Exodus sets up, and that the remainder of the book attempts to answer. The answer, in short, is that it is possible for God to dwell with the people because of the moral and cultic statutes and commandments mediated through Moses that are the pathway to holiness for Israel. For the authors of the book of Exodus, adherence to the covenant means not only to know the Lord revealed in glory, but also to follow the commands of covenant life. Knowledge of the Lord's presence and following the commandments go hand in hand. As Mark Scarlatta aptly puts it, law without divine presence can calcify into legalism, and divine presence without law can blur into obscure mysticism. The statutes, commandments, and the laws which were established at Sinai were intended as a sign of Israel's position as the chosen people. They were not simply a measure of divine control or authority, as similar laws were among Israel's neighbors, nor were they intended solely for civil governance, as with modern law codes. Instead, as a sign of Israel's election, Israel's laws set Israel apart and opened Israel to the possibility of living with holiness, the holiness of the Lord. The law is not, therefore, a burdensome obligation, but rather it is a merciful act of redemption that emanates from divine grace and holiness as a way to teach Israel how to live according to the rhythms of the Lord of creation. Patterns of justice and mercy, in holiness and purity, as an example to the nations. Even as it is passed down and applied in each new context, the Mosaic law given at Sinai would remain the core standard by which Israel would be measured in future generations. Doing a quick literary analysis, the the reader will find in Exodus 19 through 24 a mix of legal code and plot-driven narrative. The purpose of such legal code was discussed briefly above and will be elaborated upon in a bit. As for the narrative, the reader will notice a somewhat repetitive and blurry plot structure. On the one hand, this is certainly the result of several traditions being brought together into a final form. However, and I'm not saying this was or was not the intention of the redactor or editor, the final form does, though, present a time and place where the historical and the mystical are intertwined. Throughout the narrative, space and time are a somewhat foggy malaise. Moses ascends and descends the mountain, but it is often difficult to discern whether he is up or down. A few times are mentioned: the third month, 2 days of preparation, 40 days on the mountain, but these are vague, and the story is left with a sense of timelessness. Something new seems to be happening that is beyond the passage of time or any particular place. Something that will extend into the land of promise, into generations yet to come. Israel's great pause at Sinai, as Gerhard von Rad calls it, is the culmination of Israel's entrance into a timeless covenant. Exodus 19 acts as a preamble to the covenant itself. The chapter opens with a historical summary that echoes suzerain vassal treaties from ancient Mesopotamia. Verse 4 reads, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." This is an example of an ancient creedal formula in which Israel recalls God's benevolent acts as the foundation of their covenant life. The emphatic "you have seen" highlights the first-hand witness of the wilderness generation, on whose testimony the later generations will rely. The stress is on what the Lord did to the Egyptians and for the Israelites in order to redeem the people from their bondage. God is presented as the warrior God who defeated the Egyptian king and brought justice to the oppressed. And God is shown as well to be the nurturing God, the soaring eagle delivering her children from harm. Story or narrative or history and law are inseparable then. Israel's obedience in the wilderness generation, as well as in future generation, flows from thanksgiving as they remember their redemption from slavery in Egypt, and as they look forward to their salvation in the land. The story informs their commitment to the law. A practical example of this comes in the laws concerning their commitment to the vulnerable and oppressed, especially their treatment of strangers and aliens, quite unique among the peoples of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Asia Minor. After the foundation statement comes the heart of Israel's identification as God's covenant. "Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine." The term translated as treasured possession, segula, describes a beloved servant who has a special legal status in the eye of the king. In this context, segula is set within the scope of God's rule, defined at the end of verse 5 as extending over the whole earth. God's authority extends, therefore, over the whole of creation, but God has chosen one particular people to be his beloved servant. Then, after establishing the why, Exodus 19:4, and the what, Exodus 19:5, the people are told how they are to live out their calling, who they are to be, and what they are to do. Exodus 19:6 reads, You shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. In other words, as the people of the covenant, Israel is to be holy. The Hebrew root word for holy, kadash, is not easily translatable, but in its broad field of meaning, it always bears the significance of being consecrated or set apart. When used in respect to the Lord, it describes a holy otherness in relation to the creation. In the Old Testament, God is intrinsically holy, and others derive holiness only from God, from being in contact with or in the presence of the Lord. So, when Israel is called to be a holy nation, they are being told to remain in the Lord's presence. In the other part of the description, Israel is told to be a priestly kingdom. This describes the reason for Israel's consecration. The general function of priests in the ancient world was to be consecrated as mediators between the divine and the human, to carry the divine word to humanity, and to ensure that humanity's needs were set before the divine. Priests were a bridge between the sacred and the profane. In the case of Israel, the statement in Exodus 19:6 is a stunning democratization. First, all Israel, not just a select few, are invested with the priestly role. And moreover, and almost more astonishingly, all Israel is called to be a priestly kingdom on behalf of the whole world, not just their own people. In other words, and to define it more succinctly, when Israel is called to be a priestly kingdom, it means that Israel is called to reflect divine holiness to the whole world and to mediate on behalf of the whole world to God. Exodus 19:4-6 is the key to understanding the revelation of the covenant and the commands that will accompany it. These verses provide the paradigm for living out the covenant in this and in every generation. Namely, Israel is first invited to recall their Egyptian bondage and the Lord's mighty acts on their behalf. Then and only then are they capable of contemplating themselves as the Lord's treasured possession. In their self-understanding, however, they bear the responsibility of participating in the covenant by channeling holiness and blessing to the world. The people's response in Exodus 19:8, everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do, anticipates the covenant ratification rituals in Exodus 24, the sprinkling of blood and the covenant meal. The literary shape of Exodus 19-24 thus emphasizes Israel's full and complete acceptance of the covenant and the full embrace and acceptance of the Lord's ordinances for their role in the world as priestly bearers of divine holiness. The description of Sinai takes up most of the rest of chapter 19, presenting the divine descent in symbolic terms and metaphors, a language that is filled with overwhelming majesty, awe, and terror. The vivid representation is like no other theophany in the Old Testament, a gripping description of what the descent of the divine presence to earth is like. In the crescendo, Moses speaks to God and God responds in the thunder. Though the Hebrew word kol, usually translated as thunder, can also mean voice. There are clear parallels in the language used at Sinai with other theophanies from the ancient world, but Israel's theophany is unique because of Israel's special role. The magnificent display at the end of chapter 19 is only a foretaste, however, a preamble to the next step in Israel's priestly and holy formation, the reception of the Decalogue. Exodus 20, 1 through 21, contain what are commonly referred to as the Ten Commandments. In the Hebrew text of Exodus 20, they are simply called Debarim, the words. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, the Hebrew reads Ashereth Debarim, or the 10 words. In those same verses, the Greek Old Testament has translated Decalogos, the 10 words, from which derives Decalogue. For consistency and accuracy, I prefer the term Decalogue to 10 Commandments. While some modern questions remain regarding the ordering and numbering of the Decalogue, the Old Testament attests to a tradition of 10 in Exodus 34:28 and in Deuteronomy 4:13. Multiple attestations in Exodus and Deuteronomy have the words etched on 2 stone tablets and deposited in the ark. But nowhere is mention made of an exact division. Since ancient Mesopotamian covenant treaties were often written in duplicate for both parties, it is possible that all 10 were written on both tablets. Regardless of the division of tablets, the items of the Decalogue can be divided along theological lines, coinciding to the relationship that is involved. The first 4 words relate to the vertical axis, the relationship between the Lord and Israel, and they are specific to Israel in their life and worship. The final 6 words focus on human relationships and can be applied to all humanity. The 5th word about honoring one's parents acts nicely as a bridge or a fusion between these 2 axes. The Old Testament contains 2 versions of the Decalogue, in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. In Deuteronomy 5, Moses repeats the Decalogue immediately before entering the land. While there is no consensus on the actual dating of the Decalogue, it is almost certain that the Exodus version is an earlier form. Moreover, it seems likely that the Exodus version mirrors or echoes some form of very early Israelite legal tradition, maybe even predating the Sinai narrative itself. But even if not quite that old, the Decalogue is an ancient summary code that adheres to general moral principles of other regional cultures and legal traditions, with similarities of interest with the codes of Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, the most ancient law codes of the region. There are 2 features, however, that make the Israelite code stand out from its neighbors. It is the only code that insists on worshiping one God, i.e., the Lord. And it is the only code that specifies one particular weekly day to be set apart, the Sabbath. The Decalogue cannot be considered laws in any modern sense. Indeed, rather than legal statutes, they are more akin to expectations of how to live within the divinely ordered world. For Israel to be holy and priestly, Israel must be attuned to the order of the divine creation, particularly the way in which humanity was created to live in relationship with the Lord and with one another. The Decalogue at its heart is a pathway for living in relationship to the Lord and with others that is holy, and that will produce harmony with God in the clan and tribe and among the nations. It is a pathway that will prove necessary to Israel's survival, protection, and salvation as they enter the land. The Decalogue begins with an introductory formula. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The formula immediately attends to the presence of God speaking to Israel. Exodus 2:22 is pithy and easily repeatable, characteristic of an ancient creedal formula. It draws the reader back to the central confession of their faith, the redemption of the Lord from the slavery in Egypt. All the Decalogue and the related statutes that follow hinge on this creedal historical framework. The first word of the Decalogue is a sweeping statement that stands out as unique in the tradition of the ancient world. You shall have no other gods before me. The worship of a plurality of gods, or at least the recognition of their existence and importance, was a basic religious tenet in the ancient world. While the phrase, you shall have no other gods before me or in my presence, can be read in the context of henotheism or monolatry, the worship of one principal God among many, it is not the necessary reading. Indeed, the command of singular worship can hardly be expressed without at least mentioning other gods. In any event, while the question of when Israel fully embraced true monotheism is debated, the demand of exclusivity is a very early practice that will come to define the character of the nation amidst their neighbors. Moreover, exclusivity in a truly monotheistic sense will become a common theme throughout the remainder of the Old Testament. For Israel to be a holy nation requires singular devotion and remaining in the singular presence of the one true God, the Lord of creation, who alone is holy. The second word of the Decalogue, you shall not make for yourself an idol, provides greater depth to Israel's exclusive relationship with the Lord by forbidding any physical representation that Israel might bow down to or use as a representation of other gods. The Hebrew word pesel, meaning idol or image, can refer to any figure made from wood, stone, or metal to represent anything in creation. Among Israel's neighbors, such idols were essential to worship because it was believed that the gods were present in the idols themselves, with many cultures having elaborate rituals in order to entice the deity to inhabit. What is at issue in the making and use of idols is control. If God were to inhabit the idol, whoever controlled the idol would control God, or at least would control the people's access to God. The Israelites' relationship with God must be different from their neighbors. They are forbidden, therefore, to worship the Lord as if the Lord could be controlled and manipulated. In the text, the reason for the prohibition is explained as Elkanah, literally a jealous God. Jealous in this context should not be read as primarily a suspicion of infidelity, though that is certainly present in the background. Instead, Elkanah is probably best understood in the context of God's passion and zeal, a covenant love burning for the people and a divine desire for the people to share in divine holiness. The question of blessing and punishment related to this item of the Decalogue must be understood within the context of the ancient family structure at the core of society. With 3 or 4 generations living together in one household, any worship of idols would naturally affect the whole household, thus to the 3rd and 4th generation. The 1000th generation, in contrast, is a number that reflects eternity. In other words, the rewards of remaining in God's presence and seeking after divine holiness will last forever, guaranteed by God's undying faithfulness. Infidelity does have consequences, but as later biblical authors make clear, God has justice and mercy to forgive any that repent. The third word of the Decalogue: you shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, continues along the vertical axis of relationship. In the ancient world, making an oath in the name of God was a binding social and legal contract. In breaking such an oath, the oath breaker would invite retribution upon the individual and possibly upon the community. To make wrongful use of the Lord's name means to treat the name frivolously, in the exact opposite way that the Lord's glory demands. Note, however, that the prohibition does not completely bar Israel from swearing by God's name. When they did, however, they were bound to covenant law, to honor their oath in order to preserve God's glory among the nations. Regarding the fourth word of the Decalogue, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. The expectation of Sabbath rest set Israel apart from the rest of the nations. Most other cultures in the ancient world would have held an order of festivals, an order of worship according to both lunar and solar calendars. However, no other culture or religious practice set apart any single day of the established week, nor is there any known prohibition from work as part of the natural rhythm of life. Israel first learned the practice of resting on one day in 7 during the episode of the manna in the wilderness. Now, in the Decalogue, the expectation of Sabbath rest is tied explicitly to the divine order of creation, as set forth in the creation myth of Genesis 1 through 2:3. The whole community is to imitate the Lord's practice of consecrating the seventh day and ceasing from the normal patterns of work. According to the theology of creation set forth in the Old Testament, rest from work is part of the natural order, without which humanity and creation grow restless, anxious, and prone to strife and malice. The Sabbath rest is therefore prescribed for all, Israelite and alien, slave and free, even the livestock. In Deuteronomy, the theological basis of Sabbath rest will shift from creation to redemption, the Sabbath being consecrated as a sign for Israel, a reminder of their time of slavery in Egypt and the motivation for not treating others or creation with oppression. The fifth word of the Decalogue, honor your father and your mother, is a bridge between and a fusion of the vertical and the horizontal axes of relationships. On the one hand, looking again at the theology of creation found in the Old Testament, the reader will recognize that parents are honored or revered as life givers. Recall Genesis 1, in which humanity is created in the divine image, part of which image is lived out in the command to be fruitful and multiply. Parents in this theological outlook are co-creators and co-caretakers with God. In this sense, children are expected to revere parents, the co-creators, in the same way they revere God, the creator. On another level, the expectation of honoring parents is a reflection of the social reality of the ancient world, in which kinship relations were vital to survival. Notice that this is the only part of the Decalogue that looks forward to the future promise. In other words, living and thriving in the land will require the intimate bond of family and clan to maintain social order, protection, and sustenance. The expectation to not kill, the sixth word of the Decalogue, is found in most ancient law codes. In the context of ancient Israel, the expectation harkens again back to the theology of creation in which humanity is noted as being created in the image of God, an image other humans do not have the natural right, to extinguish. The story of Cain and Abel is the great precedent, such that when Cain killed Abel, the very earth cried out for justice. What is at stake is the value of human life that bears the imago Dei, the image of God, the Creator. The Hebrew word ratzak, to kill, is given no further detail or frame of reference. Of the 47 uses of ratzak in the Old Testament, it is notably never used in the context of war, and it is only occasionally used in the modern sense of murder and manslaughter, the killing with intention and killing without intention. Most frequently, ratzak applies to acts of blood vengeance. The prohibition in the Decalogue was likely originally a prohibition against such blood vengeance, designed to maintain social order. This reading also fits well in the context of the Cain and Abel story. The seventh word of the Decalogue, "You shall not commit adultery," is likewise found in most ancient law codes. While some societies only had laws aimed against women, the ancient code of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, as well as the Israelite code, applied the laws equally to men and women, in word, if not in practice. Prohibitions against adultery existed for two reasons. First, adultery was a threat to family and clan. When two entered into the bond of marriage, the breaking of said bond through adultery could dissolve not only that union, but the unity of the larger whole. Prohibitions against adultery were intended to preserve unity, protect the social order, and secure Israel in the land. On a more theological level, the prohibition against adultery was also about Israel's covenant with the Lord. For Israel, the marriage bond was a sign or a reflection of God's covenant union with Israel. Any breaking of the marriage bond could also be seen, therefore, as a breaking of the sign of the covenant and as a failure of their priestly role. Later in Israel's narrative history, the prophets will use the image of the adulterer in describing Israel's infidelity to the covenant. The eighth word of the Decalogue, the prohibition against stealing, is again a common item in ancient law codes. The Hebrew word ganav, to steal, is a broad term used for the general taking of someone else's possessions, including family members. The general gist is that if you take someone else's stuff, land, crops, livestock, family, it could have a long-lasting economic impact on the family, and even a longer-lasting social impact in terms of distrust and fear. So the prohibition against stealing is about maintaining the social order by protecting the functioning of the family and clan. As for the ninth word of the Decalogue, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor," Gerard von Rad contends that this was most certainly originally held within the context of official judicial inquiry. Like the previous four items, the expectation is about social order, maintaining the social order by protecting the legal system. Justice itself could be threatened by false witness, and the entire legal system thrown into a quagmire of distrust. Moreover, since the system itself, the laws, statutes, punishments, and procedures were established through divine intervention, bearing false witness is akin to misusing God's word and covenant. The final word of the covenant regarding covetousness is the most difficult to translate because, unlike the other terms, this one does not have any physical manifestation or visible act. The last word of the Decalogue is intangible, reflecting the inclination of the heart. The Hebrew word chamad, to desire, has a wide semantic range, but it nearly always indicates an inward disposition towards something external to the self. The idea is, in this case, is that one should not have a desire towards something else, because the disposition of one's heart should be toward the Lord. Holiness requires cultivating and disciplining the heart's desires so that even inner thoughts are held captive to the Lord. Two final points regarding the study of the Decalogue. First, the prohibitions as they are written in Exodus 20, and even in the later version in Deuteronomy 5, are not static. The expectations and the codes that accompany them have been interpreted and reinterpreted over time and throughout Israel's history and context. As Israel grew as a nation and grew in their understanding of self in relationship to God, their understanding and application of the laws also grew and changed. As an example, while the 9th item of the Decalogue began within the context of judicial proceedings, the Old Testament narrative later bears witness to slander, deception, and actions incongruent with the truth as being wrapped up under this commandment. The story of David and Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11 and 12 illustrates this point. Second, the prohibitions, particularly those found in the last 6 words of the Decalogue, are balanced in the unfolding tradition of Israel and the Old Testament narrative by equally positive expectations. After the Decalogue comes the Book of the Covenant, explicitly called so in Exodus 24:7. Historically, some of the laws in the Book of the Covenant are certainly from a pre-Mosaic agrarian society. The Israelite laws bear striking resemblance in content, form, and language to other codes among Israel's neighbors, especially those in Mesopotamia. The Israelite code, however, remains unique in the value that it places on human life over property and possession, a reflection perhaps of the place of humanity in the divine creation. The Book of the Covenant is an outflow of the Decalogue itself, an instruction on how to live and grow in holiness and as a priestly nation. In reading the Book of the Covenant, the reader will notice that it is decidedly not a comprehensive law code. Instead, the Book of the Covenant addresses a disparate collection of religious, economic, and social themes that might affect the community. Most of the laws in the Book of the Covenant are casuistic, meaning that they are hypothetical conditions. If X happens, then Y is the consequence. Apodictic or declarative law is not as common in the Old Testament, found in codified number only in the Decalogue. The use of casuistry leaves the impression that the code itself is actually not meant to be comprehensive, but instead establishes a set of principles to be followed. This way, even a relatively short law code can govern just about every aspect of life. The Book of the Covenant begins in Exodus 20:22 with a renewed emphasis on God's self-disclosure, both as the God who speaks from the heavens and the God who is present with Israel on earth. Quote, "The Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, you have seen for yourselves that I spoke with you from heaven." It is, in other words, the very God that the people are experiencing on Sinai who is delivering the code to them. While there are no explicit divisions in the Book of the Covenant, there are some natural groupings. Exodus 23 through 26 contain what have come to be known as the altar laws. The laws echo the first and second commandments, worship of the Lord alone and the prohibition against idols. Laws concerning the building of altars suggest an early time in Israel's history, reminiscent of the patriarchal narratives. The description of the rough-hewn stone suggests a time of nomadism or semi-nomadism when the people would not have had the inclination to carve the stone. However, the prohibition against carving also reflects a desire to remain separate from their neighbors, the Canaanites, who carved into their stone altars to identify their particular holy sites. Exodus 21:1 begins the mishpatim, or judicial judgments. It is worth repeating here that these statutes and the ones that follow flow from the Decalogue. Mediated by Moses, the mishpatim have a clearly identified divine source, and as Fretheim points out, are associated with the relationship that God has created with his chosen. The Mishpatim begins with laws concerning slavery, Exodus 21:1 through 11. From the historical perspective, slavery laws are an indication of a people already settled, so these laws are most likely a later addition. Slavery laws in Israel, ancient or modern, beg the question: why would the Israelites, whose very national identity is wrapped up in their redemption from a former slavery, be holding slaves themselves? There is no real answer, and none needed. There is no reason to gloss over the obvious inconsistency. It is interesting to note that later laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy surrounding the release of slaves from in the year of Jubilee seem to indicate a desire, at least, for people to be free. Exodus 21:12 through 7 contains laws concerning crimes punishable by death. Echoing the fifth and sixth words of the Decalogue, the crimes in these verses carry a gravitas that demands death, because the crimes are violations against the Creator, in whose image humanity is created and in whose work parents participate. Moreover, all of these crimes are serious breaches against the communal structure and order necessary for Israel's survival, protection, and salvation. Exodus 21:18 through 38 contains lex talionis, or laws concerning the retaliation against violence to persons or property. Summed up by the phrase, an eye for an eye, lex talionis is a general principle of ancient law codes from Asia Minor and Egypt to Mesopotamia, including the ancient codes of Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi. As administered in reality, these laws of retaliation were likely read and interpreted as overarching principles of just punishment, situationally applied by judges in unique situations. Exodus 22:1 through 15 echoes the part of the Decalogue that prohibits stealing and creates another set of overarching principles about the kinds of restitution that should be made for accidents and mishaps with another's property. Exodus 22:16 through 23:9 contains, except for a few odd statutes, laws concerning the treatment of the vulnerable. Of singular interest, Exodus 22:21 through 24 deals with the treatment of those who have no legal status or family protection: aliens, widows, and orphans. These laws are particularly unique in the Book of the Covenant because it is only here that violation brings explicit divine intervention, probably because there would be no other family to legally intervene. It is indeed a striking shift in Exodus 22:23 to the first person singular. I will hear. The reader is left with the impression of a God who has an overarching care for the oppressed, as the Lord indeed demonstrated by hearing the cries of the Israelites in Egypt. In the end, the code makes it clear that Israel is to be marked by a love for justice and mercy, and a care for the resident alien. The final set of commands in the Book of the Covenant, Exodus 23:10 through 19, concern the Sabbath rest and the annual festivals. These are both large topics, without much explanation given in the Exodus narrative at this point. The actual practices of the Sabbath and festivals are talked about at length in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and they take their shape through the generations as they are interpreted in the Mishnah and by the later rabbis. The seventh year of rest is, of course, a mirror of the seventh day of rest, deeply entwined with Israel's understanding of creation and the Creator. The word napash, to refresh, in Exodus 23:12, is elsewhere in the Old Testament translated as to breathe. In other words, the seventh day and the seventh year were established and consecrated so that all of God's creation could breathe again and be revived. The Book of the Covenant closes with a final exhortation to Israel's future in the land of Canaan. The messenger or angel who bears the authority of the Lord is curious. There is, however, no explanation given as to why it is not the Lord who leads Israel through the wilderness. The boundaries of the land reflect the limits presented to Abraham in Genesis 15, borders never actually achieved by Israel. Still, the Lord promises to drive out the inhabitants before Israel as Israel purifies the land by clearing it of any semblance of the Canaanite gods. As the Israelites are about to enter into the most important agreement in its history, they must be prepared to accept the full weight of its demands. Now, as with the inconsistency of the slavery laws, there is no need to gloss over the narrative of land theft and what moderns might call colonial oppression. It is there and must be recognized, placed in its context, not excused, but discussed. Exodus 24:1 through 18 is the scene of covenant ratification. In the ancient world, covenants, treaties, and other solemn agreements would be ratified in one of two ways: either through a covenant meal or a sacrificial blood offering. In this scene, the narrative attests to both, most likely the result of an attempted harmonization of two separate traditions. Together with the reading of the Decalogue and the Book of the Covenant, these ceremonies form the formal agreement of Israel's full participation in the covenant and the life to which the Lord has called them to live. The sacrificial blood offering is found in Exodus 24:3 through 8. According to Leviticus 17:11, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. In this scene, the blood is used according to its ancient symbolism as a sign of Israel's consecration for covenant. It is interesting to note that blood was used once before as a sign of consecration, when the Israelites covered their doorposts and lintels with the blood of the lambs and were thus passed over by death. In later cultic use, through the Levitical laws, sacrificial blood would be offered in the temple as a sign of atonement, a kind of consecration through repentance and renewal. While blood offering in the scene in Exodus 24, Moses sprinkles both the altar and the people with the sacrificial blood. The people themselves are consecrated as an acceptable offering to the Lord. The meal is recounted in a mystical rather than actual way. And they ate and drank, we read in Exodus 24:11. But the scene before describes the 70 elders, along with Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, going up the mountain. The reader is told that they saw the God of Israel, even though later sacred authors make it clear that no one shall see the Lord and live. Such is the magnificent glory of the Lord that the only description given is that which was under the Lord's feet, the pavement of sapphires. The Hebrew chazah, to behold, denotes a complete experience of the divine presence. The transformation is complete, as the former slaves now eat and drink at the table of the Lord, sealing their status as God's treasured possession. The covenant meal is fitting to complete the Sinai event and usher in the beginning of Israel's promised rest in the land, though this will now take some years to actually fulfill. In Exodus 24, with its blood consecration and covenant meal, the reader finds a literary transition for the presence of the divine. The Israelites, the elders, Moses, Joshua, and the others were consecrated so that they might come before the Lord without being consumed by divine holiness. Since the first manifestation of divine presence, God has drawn near to Moses in the burning bush, and God's presence has been on display through mighty acts in Egypt and in the glory witnessed on Sinai. The Lord had drawn near to the people, but the people had not drawn near to the Lord until now. In Exodus 24, the people, through the elders, are allowed to draw near to God. Then, at the end of Exodus 24, Moses and Joshua withdraw further up the mountain, further into the cloud of glory. And as we read in Exodus 24:16, the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. And on the 7th day, he called to Moses out of the cloud. Moses had already been in the Lord's presence. He had already been consecrated and received the Dibarim, but now Moses must be prepared. 6 days, of course, echoes the creation narrative. And on the 7th day, the consecrated time, Moses enters the consecrated space. And there, in that space and time, Moses will receive the instructions on the building of the tabernacle, so that the Lord might have a holy space where the Lord might dwell with the people of the covenant forever. Some questions for thought as we finish this section. In the first letter of Peter, chapter 2, verse 9, the author uses the language a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation to describe the Christian community. How does the Exodus narrative affect the way you might read and live out this description? If, as Paul says, life in the Spirit is the sign of the new covenant, What happens to the Mosaic Law? How can the Mosaic Law inform us as followers of Jesus still today? The law was fulfilled in Christ and made known through the Spirit in the church. How can we live out that law in our communities? As always, I have left you a bit of a bibliography for your continued study. This ends part 6 of our study on the book of Exodus. In our next part, we will learn about the tabernacle, the description of the tabernacle, how it is to be built, what is to be included, and what is to be done with it. Thank you for joining with me on our study, and I hope to see you next time.